Imagine waking up one day and realizing that half your life has been authored by someone you've never met. Your decisions, the friends you kept, the careers you pursued, the things you said yes to, and the things you ran away from, were quietly nudged by an unseen hand. Not a conspiracy, not some grand manipulative power out there in society, but something far more intimate, something living inside of you. It doesn't speak in full sentences. It doesn't introduce itself politely. Instead, it whispers in impulses, flashes of irritation, outbursts you later regret, or fears you can't logically justify. It pushes you to act against your better judgment, then slips back into the dark when you try to examine it. This presence has been with you since childhood. It knows your weaknesses, your resentments, your hunger for validation, and more disturbingly, it knows exactly how to hide from you. This phantom has a name, though it often goes unspoken. Carl Jung called it the shadow, the hidden counterpart of the self that contains everything you deny, reject, and disown. It isn't a villain in the usual sense. It isn't purely evil, like a demon on your shoulder in some medieval morality tale. It is far more troubling. It contains parts of you that you've been taught are unacceptable, too dangerous to show, too shameful to allow sunlight to touch. The paradox is this: the shadow is you, and yet you pretend it's not you. You spend years constructing a careful mask called a personality, polishing it to fit what society praises, what your parents demanded, what your peers expect. Meanwhile, the parts of you that didn't fit, the anger, the envy, the fear, but also the raw creativity, the forbidden desires, the wild and untamed vitality, they were banished into this psychological basement. And yet, when you close the door on them, they do not disappear. They gather strength in the dark. What happens to a life when the parts exiled from the surface begin to pull the strings behind the curtain? What kind of control do you really have if suppressed selves are still influencing every moment of distress, every toxic relationship pattern, every peculiar fixation you can't quite explain? You may say, well, if these traits are ugly, angry, or selfish, perhaps they should remain hidden. But tell me, by pretending they don't exist, have they really vanished? Or do you feel them stirring sometimes, in the quiet, in your moments of weakness, like an echo of a stranger's breath inside your own chest? Here is the heart of the great question. Are you truly in control of yourself if you don't acknowledge the parts of your psyche that terrify you? Or is your so-called will nothing but a polished illusion, masking the fact that forces you'd rather not recognize are already shaping the path of your life? Think of a moment when you lashed out at someone you love, shocking even yourself with the venom in your voice. Think of when you envied so deeply that praise for another felt like an insult to your very existence. Think of the times you self-sabotaged, hesitated, or undermined your own progress. Did you decide to do those things in the same way you decide what shirt to wear? No, they erupted from somewhere deeper, automatic, primal, uncontrollable. A door creaked open, and out came a voice that sounded strangely familiar in its strangeness: your shadow. Most people live their lives pretending this figure does not exist. They build moral systems, ideological identities, professional careers, and digital personas, all designed to deny that anything dark could live within them. I am a good person, they repeat to themselves, as though mantras could exercise instinct. I am not like those people, they whisper, while secretly trembling at a suspicion. Given the right pressure, the right wound, maybe they would be exactly like those people. But here lies the unsettling paradox. This force you fear may also contain what you most desperately need. For the shadow does not only hold rage and shame, it also conceals the instincts and drives you buried to keep society at ease. Your raw vitality, your deepest creativity, your unapologetic hunger to live fully without performing politeness. In trying to carve away your darkness, you may have cut away half your soul. So you walk, unknowingly, as half a being, smiling on the surface while simmering beneath, ambitious but strangely hollow, socially approved but haunted by inexplicable restlessness, outwardly successful perhaps, and yet inwardly plagued by the silent suspicion. Something essential is missing from me, though I cannot name it. What if that missing piece is your shadow? What if the very part you've been running from is the key to becoming whole? And here's the great contradiction that gnaws at the edges of awareness. The less you confront your shadow, the more power it has over you. Denial does not kill it, it feeds it. By pretending it does not exist, you make yourself even more its servant. Like a ghost that grows stronger the more you forbid anyone to speak its name, your shadow thrives on your silence. And so here we are, standing before the terrifying question, one that gnaws like a worm at the roots of every neatly arranged identity. If you are not the master of your shadow, then who is truly living your life? The question waits, heavy, unresolved, pressing against the walls of your mind like a storm that hasn't yet broken. In the coming moments, we must dare, against all instinct, to open the door and ask, why is the shadow there in the first place? And how did we become so estranged from ourselves? The hidden problem and its psychological, philosophical roots. The shadow isn't an accident. It isn't some glitch in the human mind that only a few unlucky souls suffer. It is built into the very architecture of identity. To understand why, we must walk backward, not to childhood alone, but into the oldest layers of humanity, into the fragile, trembling world where we first learned that to belong meant to survive, and to be cast out meant to die. Long before skyscrapers and glowing screens, when the human being was merely a fragile figure among forests and predators, community was everything. Safety was found in the tribe, and the tribe had rules. Behave this way, not that way. Show loyalty, not defiance. Control your urges. Follow the rituals. In that ancient theater of survival, the shadow was born. Any anger too explosive, any greed too bold, any sexuality too unruly, it all threatened cohesion. So, our ancestors learned to repress, to bury, to cloak. Somewhere deep in that long biological memory, a lesson was carved into us. Hide certain parts of yourself, or risk banishment. This instinct didn't vanish when we invented cities and smartphones. It grew sharper. From infancy, you were shaped by silent codes passed through parents, teachers, religions, and cultures. You were praised for obedience, shamed for wildness, applauded for politeness, scolded for obstinacy, loved when you fit the script, rejected when you stepped outside of it. Slowly but surely, a split took place. The parts of you celebrated under the spotlight, and the parts shoved into the shadows. Carl Jung described this as the necessary sacrifice for social identity. To become civilized, man had to repress the dark, animalistic side of his nature. Civilization demanded masks, workable versions of ourselves, clean enough for public display. But this bargain came at a cost. Every mask left behind a hidden, disowned double. But notice the cruelty here. It wasn't only the evil or violent traits you locked away. The shadow also swallowed the golden parts of you that were too inconvenient at the time. Think of the child who loved drawing until a parent mocked it as silly. The girl who burned with curiosity until she was told not to be too much. The boy who felt deep sadness but was scolded for crying. These traits too were driven into exile. The shadow does not discriminate. It stores anything unwelcome, whether vile or radiant. Nietzsche warned us of this split. When society teaches us to kill the beast within, we do not only chain cruelty, we also chain passion, vitality, daring. A person who amputates their darkness often becomes pale in their light. Stripped of rawness, they become ghostly, last men, safe, docile, but drained of fire. Nietzsche's chilling words echo here. Beware that, when fighting monsters, you yourself do not become a monster. For when you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. But what if the abyss gazing back is not just a menace, but the unrecognized totality of who we are? Schopenhauer, in his grim honesty, suggested that human beings are governed not by rational choice, but by a blind, seething will to live, a force far deeper than reason. The shadow, then, might be seen as our personal fragment of this impulsive drive, the appetites, instincts, jealousies, and raw hungers that no tidy moral code can fully dissolve. To pretend we are purely rational creatures, directed only by ideals and reason, is to deny that this untamed will pulses through our veins at every moment. Even Sartre's existentialism, brimming with freedom and choice, acknowledges a whispering paradox. We so often act in bad faith, hiding from our own freedom, pretending we are trapped in roles and identities to escape responsibility. Where does this tendency arise? The shadow again, our subterranean refuge for everything that terrifies us about liberty, responsibility, mortality. So here is the hidden problem in stark outline. The shadow is not some minor flaw. It is built into the very fabric of identity. Our social lives demand masks. Our psychology requires repression to maintain those masks. And repression always yields a counterpart, an abandoned archive of traits, impulses, and truths too raw to be carried without shame. And so, when you wake each morning and step into the world, you are not moving as a fully integrated being. You are moving as a half-being. You are a carefully sculpted fraction that society sees, while the rest of you, silently raging or yearning, waits underground. Why does this matter? Because whatever is denied does not stay inert. Psychologists call this the return of the repressed. What you refuse to consciously accept in yourself does not politely vanish. It leaks back into behavior. It shapes neuroses, anxieties, compulsions, and addictions. It sabotages relationships when unacknowledged anger suddenly erupts. It feeds envy when you see in others the very qualities you secretly banished from yourself. Jung warned, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And isn't that what so many of us feel? That life is happening to us as if fate itself has aligned against us? But what if fate is not some external punishment, but the dance of our own ignored shadow pulling strings from below? There's one more angle to explore, more unsettling still. The shadow is not only psychological, it is cultural. Nations, religions, groups, even entire civilizations also have shadows. Think of the noble values societies advertise: freedom, equality, peace, while beneath lurks exploitation, oppression, violence, rationalized as necessary. The collective shadow emerges in war, prejudice, and scapegoating. Just as individuals repress what is shameful, societies shove their crimes into forgetfulness. And just as with individuals, what is banished does not disappear. It festers, waiting to erupt. The philosopher Aldous Huxley saw this clearly. The rational world we build is always a mask, a veneer covering forces we would rather not admit. Beneath progress and civility, primordial impulses simmer. And in our refusal to face them, we guarantee they will return with more ferocity than if we had simply acknowledged them. Here lies the soft horror, the quiet reason so many remain restless despite their comforts. You were taught to amputate parts of yourself, but nobody told you that those amputated parts keep breathing below. And if you never look down, you may one day discover that the person you thought you were is merely a fragile puppet, delicately maneuvered by the invisible hands of everything you tried to bury. And the deeper, more frightening realization? Many people never come to terms with this. They pass through entire lives without facing the shadow. They succeed outwardly, yes, careers, families, reputations. But inwardly, the sense of ghostliness remains, an ache that success cannot numb. The wound persists because the wound is not about external achievement, but about the eternal divorce between the self we perform and the self we repress. This is the hidden problem. It is ancient, universal, and inexorable. And if it is ignored, it will write the script of your life without asking permission. But what exactly happens when this long-buried presence begins to surface? When the shadow refuses to remain in its cage? How does it distort not only the self, but the very fabric of our collective world? That is where our exploration must turn next, towards the unseen consequences that spill across our lives like invisible ink staining every page. the unseen consequences. You've seen shadows on a wall before, elongated, distorted, cast by light but never quite identical to the thing it reflects. That is precisely how the shadow manifests in life. Not directly, but obliquely. You rarely see it face to face. Instead, you feel its tremors in your choices, in your relationships, in the systems you inhabit. You think you're the author of your destiny, yet if you look closely, you'll notice smudges, fingerprints not your own, on every page. Those fingerprints belong to the unseen, the shadow. Consider envy. How often do you find your stomach twists when someone else succeeds? Few will admit it. Envy is ugly, small, unworthy of a noble soul. Yet, suppressed envy never dissolves. Instead, it warps the world around you. You may belittle those who thrive. You may mock achievements as lucky breaks or cheating. Or worse, you might sabotage yourself, unconsciously fearing what success will reveal about you. The shadow did not simply remain buried. It re-entered life through the cracks, bending perception itself. This is perhaps its subtlest trick. The shadow disguises itself as reality. Psychologists call this projection. We accuse others of harboring what we cannot admit in ourselves. The aggressive man calls others too hostile. The dishonest woman insists everyone else is a liar. The insecure leader claims enemies surround him at all times. Each point outward at demons, rather than inward at their own disowned impulses. And projection is not confined to individuals. Entire societies project their shadows. The atrocities of war often begin not with rational policy, but with systematic projection. The enemy is branded as evil, savage, subhuman. These are the very traits a culture disowns within itself, but cannot bear to face. Once projected, the shadow becomes fair game for destruction. The result? Catastrophe spiraling until innocents lie in the rubble. But let's come closer to the ground, to inner life itself. What else happens when the shadow is ignored? Consider compulsions. You try to maintain order, eat healthily, succeed at work, calm yourself. Yet some evenings you watch yourself devour what you promised not to touch, binge what you said you'd avoid, and procrastinate exactly what you vowed to finish. You watch yourself, stunned, as if compelled by a stranger. That stranger is closer than you think. It is the shadow, asserting appetite where discipline reigns. Or think of intimacy. You long for closeness, connection, vulnerability. Yet how often do we sabotage that very intimacy with cruelty, withdrawal, or silence? These moments are not random errors. They are the shadow demanding attention. Our hidden selves despise neglect, especially when neglected for decades, and so they erupt at the tenderest moments, tearing down what the surface self claims to cherish. Love itself becomes the battleground of the buried. Neuroscience sheds some light here. The brain does not function as a unified monarch directing its subjects. Instead, it is a parliament of competing drives, impulses, and instincts. The shadow is precisely those members of parliament who were exiled from debate, yet still cast votes in secret. Their power comes from their invisibility. A decision made unconsciously is experienced by the conscious mind as fate. You say, "I don't know why I always end up in toxic relationships," or "why I keep making the same mistakes." The truth is kinder and crueler at once. It is not fate, but the shadow repeating old motions you've refused to confront. And then there's the gnawing void, that subtle emptiness many feel even after apparent success. Why does the CEO still drink himself numb at night? Why does the celebrated artist spiral into despair? Why does the parent who sacrifices everything still feel hollow? Because the shadow was not included in those triumphs. Success built without integration will feel strangely ghost-like, as though the victories belong to someone else, or worse, as though in gaining the world, you quietly exiled your own soul. But it doesn't manifest only in individuals. Zoom out to culture. The obsession with positive vibes only, the relentless brightness of advertising, the curated smiles on social media. These are symptoms of collective shadow denial. But beneath the surface, Anxiety surges, loneliness spikes, and despair simmers. Our world has perfected masks, but masks cannot erase the features they conceal. They only deepen the hunger of the concealed. And when the shadow gathers too much strength in any one person, the consequences can spill over dramatically. Violence, breakdowns, addictions, radicalization. It is why people sometimes shock their own families. "I never thought he was capable of this," they whisper after someone detonates in rage, crime, or collapse. Yet the signs were always there, in the quiet underground of unacknowledged urges. Perhaps the strangest consequence is this: the shadow doesn't always sabotage, sometimes it saves. Picture the timid soul who never asserts themselves, always deferring, always quiet. One day, under pressure, something erupts. They shout for the first time. They seize freedom without permission. Out of character? Not really. That was the shadow, dispensing a shot of vitality denied too long. The very traits you feared might poison you could, if integrated, become medicine. The shadow is a double-edged force. Neglected, it corrupts. Recognized, it transforms. But here is where the tragedy drips in. Most people cling to denial their entire lives. They walk through decades haunted by missteps they call bad luck, by relationships they label complicated, by unspoken longings they dismiss with nervous laughter. They do not realize that the architect of these consequences is not destiny, nor cursed stars, but their own ignored self. The haunting is internal. And the scariest part? The longer you delay facing it, the stronger it becomes. Shadows grow in proportion to light denied them. What began as mild envy may swell into corrosive bitterness. What started as a manageable lie can sprawl into a life entangled by falsehood. What was once an ignored creative spark can transform into decades of regret. This is why the shadow terrifies us so deeply. Not only because it hides what is dark, but because it holds hostage what we most need to live whole. Every consequence of ignoring it is multiplied across a lifetime until the yawning truth becomes unavoidable. You lived as a fragment, while the rest of you watched from the basement window in silence. But does it have to stay that way? Is the shadow destined to enslave, sabotage, and haunt? Or is there a way, a dangerous, radical, liberating way, to turn toward it, to break the cycle, to reclaim what was lost? The next step is rebellion. Not rebellion against society merely, nor rebellion against others, but the most dangerous uprising of all. Rebellion against your own self-deceptions. To fight not with swords but with honesty. To do the unthinkable, stop running, and open the door you've spent a lifetime locking. The rebellion, how to break free. Imagine your shadow as a prisoner you have locked in a dark cellar since childhood. You've stacked furniture over the door, nailed it shut, and ignored the muffled voices from below. But here's the paradox. It is not your prisoner, it is you. And in walling it away, you change your own limbs, your own capacity to live fully. How then do we begin the rebellion, the liberation, not against the shadow, but with it? First, we must stare into a terrifying reality. Breaking free does not mean destroying the shadow. It means integrating it. That word sounds tame, almost bureaucratic. Integrate, like merging two spreadsheets. But in truth, integration is an act of spiritual revolution. It means standing face to face with every trait you swore you never had. Jealousy, cruelty, arrogance, cowardice, lust, rage. To not excuse them, to not blame others, but to admit, yes, that too is me. Carl Jung described this as the confrontation with the shadow, one of the most essential acts of inner growth, and he did not romanticize it. He warned, confronting the shadow is like wrestling dragons. You will see things you despise, impulses you recoil from, but only by admitting them into consciousness can they be redirected into creative force rather than destructive sabotage. Consider history's examples of those who rebelled not merely against society, but against their own denial. Nietzsche, though maddened by his demons, preached the ideal of the Übermensch, a human liberated from herd morality, forged not by repressing instincts, but by harnessing them into higher purposes. To him, the task was not to amputate the primitive within, but to transform it into vitality, creativity, a force of life. Or Viktor Frankl, staring into the abyss of the Holocaust, observed something profound. Even amid horror, one's ultimate freedom lay in how one chose to confront suffering. The rebellion was not in denying despair, but in acknowledging it, and then choosing meaning anyway. While Frankl spoke of meaning rather than the shadow outright, his insight parallels the same truth. The parts we avoid become less monstrous when embraced with responsibility rather than shame. So how does rebellion actually look? Not in theory, but in the practice of everyday life. Begin with honesty. Brutal honesty. Take a moment to watch your reflexive judgments. "I'm not angry," you tell your partner, even as your tone drips venom. "I'm not jealous," you insist, while your thoughts revolve around someone else's praise. The rebellion begins when you stop lying, not to others first, but to yourself. Call the impulses by name. Speak to them plainly. "Yes, I feel envy. Yes, I feel rage. Yes, I want what is forbidden." This is not a confession to be punished, but recognition to be integrated. The second step is dialogue. Jung often encouraged what he called active imagination, speaking with the shadow as though it were a living figure. Sit alone, close your eyes, imagine the part of you long exiled as a figure, maybe a snarling beast, maybe a cunning double, maybe a wounded child. Let it speak. What does it want? Why was it silenced? This may feel absurd, theatrical, yet through this absurd theater, the shadow loosens its grip, moving from puppeteer to partner. But beware, rebellion is not indulgence. Integration does not mean unleashing every dark impulse recklessly. Freedom is not the same as chaos. To integrate the shadow means to transform its power, not surrender to it. Anger, when denied, corrodes. Anger, when integrated, becomes assertiveness, clarity, and energy. Envy, when denied, poisons. Envy, when faced, can reveal what you deeply desire but never dared to claim. Desire, when denied, twists into compulsion. Desire, when acknowledged, becomes the fire that animates creativity. Think of artists who dared to crack their shadows open. Dostoevsky, who wrestled with despair and guilt until it spilled into novels that probed the human soul. Frida Kahlo, who painted her pain into vibrant confrontations rather than concealing it. Each refused to amputate their shadow. Instead, they let it bleed into expression. This is the creative rebellion, to turn wounds into art, shame into courage, denial into truth. Now, you may be tempted to ask, what if my shadow is more dangerous than that? What if acknowledging it makes me crueler, riskier, darker? That fear is natural, but remember, the shadow is already acting in your life. Denial doesn't neutralize it. It only ensures its eruptions come unannounced, uncontrolled. By consciously admitting, you gain the chance to integrate with responsibility. It is not indulgence, it is shepherding. Without recognition, the shadow is the wolf tearing the flock apart in darkness. With recognition, it can become the hound guarding the threshold. But rebellion requires courage. Few dare it because it feels like treason against the self-image we've polished for decades. You want to believe you are kind, patient, disciplined. To admit the shadow may mean saying, I am also selfish, impatient, indulgent. The polite personality doesn't want to share the throne. This is why most people never rebel. They settle for masks. They prefer applause for the mask to the wholeness of the self. Yet imagine the freedom if you refuse to keep up the charade. Imagine walking through life no longer terrified that someone might expose the darkness, because you have already exposed it yourself. Imagine love untainted by bitterness, ambition unpoisoned by sabotage, creativity unchained from doubt. That is the promise of the rebellion. It grants not perfection, but wholeness. For rebellion is not about becoming gods, it is about becoming real. To integrate shadow is to show up in full, scarred but authentic, fractured but honest. And that, strangely enough, becomes the source of genuine power. A man or woman who has embraced their shadow is not easily manipulated because they cannot be shamed with their own hidden traits. They have already owned them. They become, paradoxically, freer. History reveres such figures. Think of Socrates, who welcomed insults with calm laughter because he knew himself too deeply to be unraveled by others' projections. Think of Nelson Mandela, who after decades in prison emerged without bitterness consuming him, not by denying anger, but by using it as fuel for reconciliation instead of vengeance. Both illustrate rebellion not against others merely, but against their own shadows pulled toward fear and hatred. This is the radical invitation, to dare the inner revolution that makes outer revolutions possible. How can a civilization integrate its shadow of violence, exploitation, and hypocrisy if individuals do not first integrate their own? The rebellion begins within. It begins with you. And if you choose it, you begin a process that threatens the greatest illusion of all, that you were ever powerless before your shadow. Yet even here, something deeper waits. One last revelation beyond rebellion, beyond integration. For once you wrestle the shadow into the light, you begin to glimpse a truth more startling still, that the shadow was never an enemy at all. It was a guardian, holding the keys to a reality too immense to recognize fully until you became strong enough to face it. The ultimate truth, the final, most powerful realization. There comes a moment in shadow work when something astonishing happens. At first, the shadow is grotesque, terrifying, shameful. You approach it like someone approaching a predator in the night, trembling but determined. Yet as your eyes grow accustomed to its contours, something shifts. The monster does not roar, it sighs. The darkness you feared wears your own face. And then the unimaginable dawns. The shadow is not here to destroy you, it is here to complete you. This is the ultimate truth most never grasp. The shadow is not an intruder, it is your unlived life. It is half of you quarantined, silenced, disguised as an enemy. To reject it is to reject yourself. To integrate it is to become, at last, whole. Imagine a mosaic shattered into dozens of pieces. If you only polish the bright tiles, compassion, kindness, discipline, but sweep the darker tiles, anger, sensuality, wildness, beneath the rug, the picture can never form. It remains fragmented, dull, incomplete. The true image of yourself can only be seen when both bright and dark pieces are placed together. As Jung once wrote, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. What does this mean, practically? It means your shadow contains gifts disguised as curses. Your aggression, refined, becomes courage. Your envy, acknowledged, becomes a compass pointing toward your own neglected desires. Your shame, faced, becomes empathy for others' suffering. Your darkness, unveiled, becomes depth. The kind of depth shallow positivity can never reach. The paradox is exquisite. What you thought made you broken was precisely what makes you whole. Think of the mythic stories humanity has treasured. Heroes do not become wise by avoiding darkness. They descend into the underworld. Orpheus goes into Hades for Eurydice. Dante walks through hell before glimpsing heaven. Even Christ descends into death before resurrection. Why? Because the deepest transformation requires confrontation with what we fear most. The shadow is the personal underworld. To enter it is terrifying, but only there do we recover the lost gold. Psychology has a name for this idea, the golden shadow. Not everything exiled to the subconscious is demonic. Much of it is radiant. Your forbidden passions, your suppressed talents, your wild imagination. These aspects frightened caretakers, threatened authority figures, or challenged collective norms, so you locked them away. But they are still yours. And when the cellar door finally creaks open, you discover treasures you thought were lost forever. Nietzsche urged humanity to say yes to all of life, not merely the convenient half. His ideal figure, the one who could dance with existence rather than recoil from it, was the individual who embraced joy and sorrow, creation and destruction, light and dark. Integration is essentially saying yes, a wholehearted affirmation of everything you are, without amputating the inconvenient. And consider Viktor Frankl again. When he declared that suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning, he was pointing toward the same realization. The pain we bury becomes unbearable precisely because it is denied. But the moment we accept it into the story of who we are, the pain becomes purpose. The shadow is not the site of meaninglessness. It is the birthplace of meaning, waiting for acknowledgement. So the final realization unfolds. The shadow is not a curse, but a mirror. To fear it is to live half a life. To embrace it is to expand into the wholeness of what you always were. Take a quiet moment to imagine this. All the traits you rejected stand in a circle before you. The angry one, the arrogant one, the lustful one, the greedy one. Yes, but also the passionate one, the imaginative one, the fearless one. Each extends a hand. What would happen if, instead of banishing them, you clasped it? The answer is this. You would stop living as a ghost. You would stop hiding behind masks and illusions. You would become uncomfortably real, perhaps unsettling to those who prefer polite fictions, but also luminous, alive in a way that trimmed-down selves can never be. You would discover that authenticity feels dangerous, but is, in fact, the safest place to live. Because imposters are the ones constantly hunted by exposure. Integration leads to maturity, and maturity is simply this: the ability to hold contradiction without disintegration. To say, yes, I am kind and cruel, brave and cowardly, whole and fractured, luminous and shadowed, and I am still one. That is not hypocrisy, that is being human. And here comes the liberation. Once you accept your own shadow, the world's shadows lose their terror. You no longer have to project, accuse, or scapegoat. You can see cruelty in others without blind hatred, because you have faced cruelty in yourself. You can meet envy, shame, and greed without judgment, because you know those rivers too. This birth of compassion radiates outward, changing not only you, but the world. Make no mistake, civilizations crumble when they repress their shadows. Wars ignite from projection, oppression festers from denial. But civilizations can heal when individuals dare to face their own darkness, and in so doing, illuminate the collective dark. That is why shadow work is not merely personal therapy, it is cultural responsibility. So where does this leave us, standing here at the edge of revelation? You are faced with a choice as old as myth. #meta, pause, synchronize 0.05, remain half-being, polished mask, restless ghost, or descend, confront, integrate, and rise. To say yes to the shadow is to say yes to the entirety of life, not the edited version that fits polite expectations. And if you do, if you risk this final rebellion, you will discover something astonishing hidden at the heart of the shadow. It loved you all along. The shadow was not lurking to sabotage you. It was exiled because it scared those who couldn't handle its intensity. It was left behind, like a child locked in the dark. And all it ever wanted, through all the projections, compulsions, and sabotage, was for you to come back for it. Here is the cinematic ending, the curtain lifted. The monster was the orphan part of you, waiting for recognition. The prison guard was the rescuer in disguise. The shadow you feared was, impossibly, your twin. So embrace it, not to indulge, but to unify. Not to glorify darkness, but to weave it into light. Because when you do, you will finally speak not as fragments of a self, but as a whole being. You will, for the first time, stop merely surviving and begin living. And when you walk into the world with your shadow at your side, you no longer need approval, masks, or denial. You move freely, authentically, red-blooded, and whole. You cease being a ghost. You become real.